Thank you very much indeed, Charles, for your welcome and for convening today's webinar and asking me to address it. I've been to a number of MINAS events over the years and always found them extremely interesting. I very much hope that I can leave your audience feeling the same in an hour's time. If I just start by asking myself the question, or saving somebody else from asking it, why a book about African demography? The simple answer to that is that what has happened in African demography over the last 60 to 70 years has rightly been described as the greatest demographic upheaval in history. Yet, beyond the world of a few professions, demographers, family planning practitioners, and activists, it seems to me that it was rarely factored in, and its potential consequences are often overlooked or, dare I say it, fabricated. Let me give you a couple of examples of where demography, and Africa's demography in particular, is absent. In 2018, the MOD produced its wonderful Global Strategic Trends report, and demography hardly featured. Now, I'm not just picking on the MOD here. It's a typical oversight. I spend a lot of time reading election commentaries to do with Africa, and seldom is demography specifically analysed and pulled apart. Now, for example, if we look at Kenya, where we've just had elections this year, the local fertility and population data gives absolutely invaluable insights into what is going on behind the scenes. And if we look towards 2030, for example, here's just one little fact. Because of the fertility rate, the ethnically Somali population will move from being the sixth to the fourth most numerous ethnic group in the elections. So, demography matters to elections as it does to almost everything else. Now, I'm not a demographic determinist, but there is very little that Africa's population trends will not impact materially over the next 20 to 30 years. I'm thinking of climate change and climate change goals, global food security, global trade patterns, global labor supply and job market, and geopolitics. I mean, consider what a smorgasbord of political interests, external political interests, are already involved in the Horn of Africa, for example, both formally and informally. And in demographic terms alone, Africa is now center stage. The rate of growth in Africa after 2050, and especially the growth of the populations of a number of individual countries, will largely determine whether or not, or when precisely, the global population will peak and stabilize. And this is a very contentious issue, particularly in relation to climate change at the moment. So I hoped it would be useful to produce a thought-provoking, non-prescriptive, and non-ideological handbook on the topic for a generalist reader, but that also passes muster with demographic experts. And having presented the figures, it's really up to the reader what implications they draw for their own area of expertise or experience. There's always been a tendency as well in the West to look at what's going on in Africa and demography with very much a Western eye. And something I sought to do very deliberately was to involve African experts and, wherever possible, to put their opinions on certain topics to the fore. For example, on the thorny issue of population density, job markets, youth prospects and protests, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please, Charles. So for anyone, I expect everyone in this audience is familiar with the excuse me, headline figures, but for anyone who isn't, this gives you the picture over the course of a century. And the headline numbers are, as far as Africa is concerned, truly extraordinary. What has occurred in the population increasing from just over 220 million in 1950 to reach nearly 2.5 billion a century later, so in 30 years' time, 2050. This is less of an explosion. We often read in the papers about population explosions, and more of a sort of tectonic shift. That's the quake, if you like, in the title of my book, Youthquake. So by 2050, a quarter of the global population will be African, compared to less than 10% in 1950. And conversely, the population of Europe will have decreased from being about 20% to being about 7%. And as you can see in the right-hand column, the growth factor in Africa over that century is about 11 times. And by comparison, during its period of greatest population expansion between 1920 and 2020, India's population multiplied by a factor of about 5 only, inverted commas, and Asia's population between 1950 and 2050 will have expanded by a factor of about 4. So what is happening in Africa is, by any standards, a huge global development. It's caused in part by improving mortality. Life expectancy at birth is now over 60 years and continues to rise, but it's substantially accounted for by slow, or in some countries non-existent, fertility declines in Eastern, Western, and Middle or Central Africa. Now, between now and 2050, and I've referred to Africa moving to center stage in demographic terms, between now and 2050, about 65% of global population growth will be accounted for by Africa. This figure, I hasten to add, is substantially baked in, as they say. So even if fertility dropped from an average of 4.3 births per mother now to immediately to replacement level tomorrow, 2.1 births per mother, existing age structures within Africa would still see the figure of population rise to 2 billion. And of course, an immediate fall to replacement level fertility is not possible. Next slide, please. Again, some of you will be familiar, I'm sure, with maps like this. But and this I include right at the beginning of the book, because I think geography and demography have to be considered very much together. They are essential building blocks of knowledge of the continent, both for African populations and for those of us elsewhere in the world. And this, in a sense, is something of an antidote, perhaps, to a general expression of shock about the continent accounting for a quarter of the world's population. Because, as you can see, all of these geographical areas fit comfortably within the landmass of Africa. So you've got the continental US, China, India, Europe, Japan. It's a reminder that Africa is 1/5 of the world's landmass, and that Algeria and DRC, for example, are both, or each, 4 times bigger than metropolitan France, that Niger, Chad, Mali, South Africa, Angola, all twice the size of France or indeed of Ukraine. So we must not, when taking on board the size of this population surge, we also need to, I think, keep our feet on the ground in terms of the basic geography and the size of the African continent. Next slide, please, Charles. Now, reverting to the figures, just getting this up closer to me so that I can see it. You can see that quite a number of countries, it's it's 10 here, I think, have increased by considerably, their populations by considerably more than the average of 11 times. You can see Kenya over on the right-hand column shows population will have expanded by 15 times over the course of the century. And at the top of the list, Niger's population will have expanded by 25 times. And these are very, very material increases in the context of world population growth of 4 times over that period. Now, the list of countries here raises a vital issue that I go to great pains to continually, repeatedly, to point out in Youthquake, and that is how heterogeneous the demographic development of individual countries is. All countries are not the same, and the demographer Jack Goldston put this rather well, saying no general statement about African demography is true. So although demographic transitions means the move from high fertility and high mortality to low fertility and low mortality have occurred in most of northern and southern Africa, the fertility rate in Western, Eastern and Middle African countries still ranges between about 4.3 births and in Middle Africa 5.9 births. But there are, of course, substantial variations even within regions. If we could have the next slide, please. Now, there is one characteristic which is shared by all countries, no matter where they are on the sort of chart of the fertility transition, and that is youthfulness. We often hear talk of a youth bulge, and I'm not sure that's really the right term, because this youthfulness, the statistics similar to what you're looking at, and which I'll go into in some detail in a minute, youthfulness has been a feature since the 1950s, and it will continue well beyond 2050. So it isn't actually a sort of bulge yet. It is an open-ended development. One leading demographer has referred to the situation as being one of chronic youthfulness. And I think that's quite a good term. Chronic, not in any not meant in any critical way, but more in a medical way of it being entrenched. Now, if we take the country at the top, for example, Niger, 50% of the population in 2020 were aged between 0 and 14. So you have a median age of 15.2 years. Even in 2050, 41% of the population will be under the age of 14, and the median age will still be below 20 years. If you go down to the column, to the rows at the bottom, you can see, and this is something that President of Sierra Leone referred to just yesterday in the US-Africa Summit, that even in 2050, Africa's median age will be below 25 years. So this is really a fascinating counterpoint, if you like, to the fact that an increasing number of countries around the world are experiencing population decline now. If we look to mid-century, about 40% of children, all children born worldwide, will be African. 1/3 of global youth, that is the term generally used to describe young men and women between the ages of 15 and 24, 1/3 of global youth will be African, and 1/3 of the global working age population. So I think these sorts of statistics should get us all thinking and reimagining substantially the world in which we operate, no matter what our field is. This youthfulness indeed underwrites the fact that by 2050, Nigeria will have a population greater than that of the EU, and East and West Africa will each have a population larger than Greater Europe, the continental landmass, so including Russia and so forth. As far as labour markets are concerned, I mentioned that at the beginning, and Africa will be adding about 250 million people to its workforce during the 2020s alone, a number that's comparable with the EU's total workforce. And that's in a single decade. If that sounds alarming, then perhaps let's think that since the early 90s, the labour force of sub-Saharan Africa has increased from 230 million to 610 million. So there have, for a long time, been very substantial numbers of people reaching working age and having to find some form of occupation, mostly in the informal sector. Now, the choice of countries here, I'll just say, was a relatively simple one. I call these countries the doubling dozen in the book. They are the dozen countries where the population, the dozen populous countries, whose populations will double between now and 2050. So on the whole, they're showing an increase of about 3% per annum, some a little more, some a little less. And I stress test the projections for the next 20, 30 years of each of these countries. And I'll come back to that in a second. I'd just point out, perhaps to preempt a question along these lines, that you will see the third column along and the sixth show total child and old age dependency ratios. And these remain very high. They remain far higher, well, certainly far higher now than they need to be for any, inverted commas, demographic dividend to be realizable. And even in 2050, many of these countries' dependency ratios remain on the high side for that to occur. We may get a question about demographic dividend. It's a very interesting economic theory, but a term which I'm afraid has now been rendered virtually meaningless by overuse and misuse. And it's a term that it seems largely to mean what the person speaking about it wants it to mean. So we can perhaps come back to that if anyone's interested. But all of these countries, however you define demographic dividend, are very far from attaining one. Now, if we can move on to the next slide, please. This is the doubling dozen here. Now, in these last a few minutes, I'll be alluding a bit to some received wisdom and generalizations that we are often confronted with, and which we need to guard against. One of the points of analyzing and stress testing the United Nations population division's projections for these countries, the doubling dozen, over the next 20 or 30 years, is that every now and then a commentator will pop up and gain attention and column inches from saying, it'll never happen, fertility will fall much faster over the next 2 to 3 decades than the United Nations says. And the United Nations has always been deliberately alarmist. Well, in the context of Africa, this is just so much nonsense, I'm afraid. And if we look, if we can have the next slide, I may need to come back to that one. Yeah, on this next slide actually shows how United Nations population division projections for 2050 have had to be increased for African countries since the beginning of this century. So if we just take, for example, Cameroon, about 6th one down, in its 2008 revision, the revisions tend to come every two to 3 years from United Nations population division, which is still the leading authority of population projections. You'll see the population Cameroon was in 2050 was projected to be 37 million. Well, in the 2019 revision, the median variant projection had risen to 51 million in 2050. So that was an increase of 38%. If you go right down to the bottom of the list of countries, basically for the whole of Africa, since the 2008 revision, 25% down there in the bottom right-hand corner has been added to projections for Africa. And that is as a result of fertility rates remaining high or experiencing slow transition downwards towards replacement. If we could go back a slide, Charles, if that's possible again. So I thought it was important to look at the individual figures for countries, for these countries, which between them will account for, or it's about half of Africa, the total Africa population increase between now and 2050. Now, if we look, for example, at, let's look at Angola. So in the left-hand column, you've got a fertility rate in the early 90s of 7.1 births per mother. Now, by 2015-20, this had fallen to 5.6 births. So over that period, roughly 30 years, the total decline in the fertility rate was 1.5 births. Half a birth a decade, quite a slow decline. So the question was that I asked myself, looking at the projections going forward, was it realistic to expect a population decline of a further 1.7, of a fertility rate decline of a further 1.7 births in the next 30 years? And the straight answer is probably yes, that is an acceptable projection to make. But there are 6 of these countries where almost any decline at all is, in a sense, mathematical guesswork, because a fertility rate decline hasn't even commenced. So, for example, if I find one of those, in the case of Nigeria, for example, there's been a decline of 1 birth in the fertility rate over the last 30 years. That's very slow decline indeed. And yet a decline over the next 30 years of 1.8 births is projected. Now, that may happen, but at the moment, there are indicators to suggest, plenty of indicators, that actually the figures may come out higher than the median projection rather than lower. Overall, I will have to say that this is the conclusion of this exercise was that the UN projections for 2050 for the whole continent and regionally are on the basis of current information pretty unimpeachable, although things may change. So if we then go forward to the next slide again. Now, the interesting thing, thank you, Charles, is that had the UN stuck with its projections made for 2020, made in the mid-1990s, they would have been extraordinarily accurate, within 2% for the whole continent, and for most regions within about 4 to 5%. But the UN then projected a fertility decline occurring, which in many countries did not, and that's why it had to start raising its projections again. Now, excuse me, next slide, please. Now, these are, I love looking at these for all countries. These are fertility maps on the left for Mozambique, on the right for Nigeria. And I'd like, as just finishing off, to return to the vital importance of appreciating the heterogeneity of demography within the continent. And I'm guessing that all of you in your day-to-day work are extremely interested in detail, and this is the sort of detail that one builds up from in looking at the demography of individual countries. I'll say a bit more about the maps in just a second. I'd also like, as well, finishing off, to counsel again about received wisdom and generalization. I think that these relatively detailed fertility maps are a very good reminder of the difficulty about generalizing about African demography. And often the biggest generalizations, so about headline figures and so forth, are made with very little reference to what's happening at ground level. Now, these maps are both produced by the Demographic and Health Survey program, which has been running since 1984. Along with censuses, they provide some of the best data taken with censuses. They provide us, with just population data that is a great deal more useful than one sometimes is told. About 400 surveys have been conducted. They're always joint ventures between an American outfit called ICF and National Bureaus of Statistics. And a lot of I think a majority of the 400 surveys have been done on African countries. Now, one of the key reasons why it's such useful data, and anyone working on a country, on a, I don't know, doing a risk profile or whatever, if you don't use DHS surveys, I would strongly recommend that you do in future, because there's a great deal more in there than just fertility data. The samples are very big indeed. So, for example, a sample for Nigeria is 42,000 households, and the findings are then weighted so that you get an accurate representation of national and regional numbers and preferences. It's the go-to source, DHS, not well for demographers, but also increasingly for others. And as I say, there's an immense amount of information. Even the questionnaires done in each household, one for the man, one for a woman, include everything from what possessions are in the household. People are, men and women are questioned separately. They're questioned about all aspects of domestic life and possessions and features of their daily lives and so forth. Now, just sticking though with fertility, the most obvious thing that these two maps show is that it's only in the capitals where fertility rates are relatively low. Everywhere else, fertility rates remain at 4 births per mother or higher. Now, it's often said, here's one of those generalizations, that urbanization drives down fertility. Well, there is an element of truth in that in urban settings, fertility does tend to be lower. But if you're looking at the capital cities here, then they can't be relied upon to complete a fertility transition for an entire country. Both Nigeria and Mozambique are already 40 to 50% urbanized, according to most statistics, and yet the average fertility rate is still above 4 in Nigeria and above 5 in Mozambique. If you take another country like Angola, which is said to be about 70% urbanized, if urbanization is leading to lower fertility, then how do you explain the fact that the fertility rate is still around 6 births? So going into detail about the countries can provide all of us, no matter what our fields, with a considerable amount of local information that is extremely valuable. Sticking with this, the issue of urbanization and fertility transition, you will often hear a particular capital plucked out of the bag, as it were. The late great Hans Rosling, the author of Factfulness, used to say, "Look at Addis Ababa. Its fertility rate is less than 2 births. That is where Africa is going," just like Asia did. Well, I'm a huge respecter of Hans Rosling, but Addis was exceptional, not just in Africa, but also within Ethiopia among cities. And there are very specific historic reasons why the fertility rate fell below 2 births per mother. And it is, in fact, now rising again. And it may well rise as much as 3. So one has to be careful about these examples that are frequently plucked as if they are representative of a continent-wide occurrence. The real fertility declines in these two countries, for example, have to begin in rural areas, not as a result of urbanization. That is, the key thing to remember there. There are other anomalies that just help us keep alive the idea of exceptionalism and not thinking, well, this is Africa. this is in Africa, it's going to go the same way as country X from outside. This is Africa, so this is Africa. This is Nigeria, so this is Nigeria. It will go through a transition entirely of its own. Another sort of common generalization you'll hear is it's all about secondary education for girls. This is obviously a very important thing. And there is also a tendency for girls and young women who have had secondary education to have fewer births, for example, in these two countries, than those that have not completed secondary education. But it does not, on its own, bring about a fertility transition. Now, for example, in the most recent DHS survey done for DRC, among women who had completed 9 to 10 years of secondary education, the fertility rate was 6 births. It was also 6 births, interestingly, among the richest quintile of women, so the top 20%. So in both cases, you don't have, you're seeing defiance, as it were, of the received wisdom that the richer you are, the better educated you are, the more automatically a fertility transition occurs. Ditto in Uganda and in Nigeria, the fertility rate among the richest quintile still above 4 births in both countries. And in fact, there are only 12 countries in the continent where women have completed women who have completed 9 to 10 years of secondary education have a fertility rate below 4. So my only point here is that whatever we're doing, we have to look at the country and the regions within countries on their own terms, and not always imagining some other part of the world where X and Y happened, because Africa as a whole is going through a fertility transition, but it is a transition that is made up of a smorgasbord of factors, the details of which we need to be aware. So in conclusion, with the book and the data, I know I've presented quite a lot of data today, but you've got the slides. Do please go back if you would like, and if anyone has questions that there aren't time for now, then just send an email to me at edward@africaresearchinstitute.org. But both today and in the book, I've sought to provide a scrupulously objective handbook. It's neither it doesn't come to either Panglossian conclusions nor is it doom laden. And in fact, I think such binary narratives as those don't serve the purposes of anyone except those who make them up. I'm merely seeking to present the data and suggest it is incorporated ever more closely in thinking and in planning for the world that we will all live in, whether it is as investors or lawyers or governments or whatever. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Edward. That was excellent. Very, very good. We've got a few questions, and I wonder if you can talk about them. The first one is, how are countries in the world going to develop the economies of these countries fast enough to keep pace with the demographic developments? Theo Val says it reads like a looming disaster. I wonder if you can talk about that, and then we can look at opportunities.
Yeah, I think the sort of the disaster narrative, as far as Africa is concerned, has been around for a long time, and there is no doubt that developing, when you have economic development, when you are continually recording 2.5–3% population growth per annum, it is made all the harder. But it's firstly on the narrative. I would say that doom-laden narratives have been around forever. I mean, since the late 1960s. If you go back to look at World Bank reports from the 1980s, there were three big ones, very significant ones, relating to Africa and its demography, and also the Economic Commission of Africa weighing in as well. The big question was, well, this just has to be a disaster. How on earth do we avoid the disaster that this population growth it will inevitably bring? How are we going to provide jobs for all these extra people? And the disaster. I mean, I don't wish to, as I say, take a sort of Panglossian angle on all of this, but the disaster on a scale that was predicted and continued to be predicted in every decade since, did not come about. And I think we therefore have to be quite critical about how and why these narratives are constructed and whose interests are they in. I slipped in a statistic halfway through, or when talking about jobs, that about 400 million young people have been absorbed into the workforce since the 1990s. Now, across the whole continent, virtually, no matter what has happened, poverty levels have improved over the time. Calorie intake has improved. Certainly mortality rates have improved dramatically. So I'm not saying that I'm not here to say that the doom-laden narrative is going to be wrong, because I don't have a crystal ball. I'm saying they've substantially been wrong so far, and I think we need to be more critical of why these narratives come about. I mean, in essence, I'll go back to, if you need me to be more precise, if we go back to the 70s and the 80s, what was it all? The narrative was fashioned by the World Bank, by American philanthropic foundations, by family planning groups, and so forth, with varying measures of goodwill, in response to Indian famines, and also to the Cold War being fought out in Asia. And it was felt that poor people were more likely to be communist, and therefore poor populations in the, inverted commas, third world should, wherever possible, be persuaded, and if not forced, to have smaller families. Yeah. Now that in a nutshell is where that was the beginning of these doom-laden stories. Now, I dare say that the person who's asked this question, could say to me, well, I was in Abidjan yesterday, and I just can't imagine where these jobs are going to come from. Well, yeah, okay, but don't. In many places, in many countries, in many villages, this supply of extra people is being absorbed. It may be altogether more better for growth and all sorts of things if there weren't quite so many of them, but it is by no means. I really want to counsel very strongly, because I think it's counterproductive against the sort of crisis-laden writings of, for example, Robert Kaplan in the 90s. Yeah. This is just shouting fire, fire forever, as it were. Okay. Now, part of the secret, sorry to carry on with that question, part of the secret to dealing with the numbers is planning. And there are governments around the continent for example, Egypt, Rwanda, South Africa, that take the economic planning relating to population size very seriously indeed. There are others that take it less seriously.
Okay, we've got a number of other questions. There's one here linked to the opportunities for the continent and which sectors are going to be important. Presumably with urbanization, then fast-moving goods, and gradually, as more and more people move in to the middle classes, there is going to be more opportunities for consumer goods. But also, what about raw materials?
Yes, well, I mean, sorry, I'm really here to speak about the numbers rather than and thinking that the people in the audience are the experts at where the opportunities lie. But I mean, opportunities abound. I mean, I imagine there are a great many investors in Africa in the audience, and somebody would be able to chip in if we had an open forum here saying, well, I'll tell you about the construction materials market in this country X or whatever. So I'm afraid if it's it may be ducking the question, but I think that these figures, if you like, speak as much to opportunity as they do to what they, if not more so, as they do to what the previous questioner asked about, isn't this going to make things very difficult indeed?
Okay, let's stick to the figures then. You were talking about Egypt being one of the countries that's now encouraging family planning. Andy Ballard says that they're trying to limit into two children per capita. Which other countries have active family planning measures to try and limit population?
Right. Yes. Sorry. Just to clarify what I meant when I mentioned planning in conjunction with Egypt, it was their economic planning. So they take the population numbers very seriously indeed, and that you can see as a consequence of that the building of new cities going on, intense concern about food security in the long term. So you can see the government mind is very alive to demography. But of course, the questioner is also right that yes, they did, like most countries in Northern Africa, encourage efficient and efficacious family planning programs. Now, the interesting thing about Egypt specifically is that as they were getting down quite close to replacement level fertility, which is 2.1 births per mother, and the fertility rate had fallen below 3, it then stopped and rose again. And there is a big counter, like the debt counter used to be in Times Square. I don't know if it's still there. I haven't been to New York for a while. But with the population counting on it above a government building in Cairo. And what this means from an economic planning point of view is that the government, because the fertility fall stalled, they're now looking at a population in mid-century of about 160 million, whereas they were planning on it peaking at about 130 million. South Africa's in a similar situation because of the effect of retrovirals in controlling the mortality among those who are suffering from HIV/AIDS. So in both countries, they will reach larger populations than they thought they were. Now, why it's happened in Egypt is itself a subject of great debate among demographers, and if someone wants, I will go into that if somebody else wanted it to. But it's sort of quite technical, and there is no clear answer. So yes, Egypt has encouraged family planning. Rwanda has encouraged family planning. there are many countries in the continent that have done. I mean, in Malawi and Zambia, for example, the contraceptive prevalence rate, so usage rate among women is now above 50%. But going back to this, you've got to be careful with general rules. The interesting thing is that in both those countries, the usage of modern contraceptive methods is high enough to be associated and has been associated elsewhere in the world with fertility rates of, say, 3.5 births. But in both Malawi and Zambia, women are still having, on average, more than 4 children that survive. And there is evidence to suggest that in many cases, women are using contraception not to have fewer children, but to effectively space them out better, so there is less risk to themselves, and the child has better health. So those are interesting examples. But some of the big and fastest growing countries have really no family planning regime to speak of, and very low usage of modern contraceptive methods. Nigeria, DRC, for example. The 2 countries that went first on this and very effectively were Ghana and Kenya, where their own governments, not due to Western pressure, as it were, their own governments looked at the figures when the fertility rates had reached 8 births. We're going back to the late 70s here, and said, we cannot do the things the first questioner was talking about. We cannot build the schools. We cannot build the hospitals, etc., if this continues. And in both cases, fertility is less than half that rate now.
Okay. We've got quite a few questions, so if we can have short answers, please.
Okay.
One on climate change. In many ways, a lot of the areas most affected by climate change are going to be those with the highest fertility rates. Will climate change have a dampening effect on population growth, or will that lead to large-scale migration?
It could, but it depends what you're talking about by migration as well. I mean, for thousands of years, rural populations have been used to moving, particularly pastoralist populations. And, the intra-African migration rates are increasing, but generally people are not going. People are not actually crossing national borders. But climate change, it does present threats, but also I think we need to keep a sense of context. I mean, for example, less than 10% of the coastal areas that are said in various authoritative reports to be most vulnerable to rising sea levels, less than 10% of those areas are African shorelines. So again, this is like looking at fertility. We need to look local and focus on that. A lot of the narratives about climate change are very, very general. And I don't think that helps those who are affected, and it leads to, it encourages cynicism. We've got to be specific.
Right. What impact does religion have on the figures?
Very good question. It varies enormously. I mean, one of the most effective family planning programs and reduction of fertility ever affected anywhere in the world was by the Ayatollahs in Iran after the revolution, where fertility fell from 7 to about 2 births within the space of 25 years. If you look at a map of Nigeria, You could say, well, fertility is higher among Muslim families in the north than it is with Christian families. But actually, that map that I put up shows there's not much in it. And many Christian families there are a huge number of Christian families who are equally pronatalist, i.e. they want large families. Where I would say, so that's not to say that religion isn't a factor, because where, for example, it is a factor, is that in some parts of the Sahelian countries, you have very, very conservative, not very well educated clerics. And this acts as a formidable barrier to national governments themselves wanting to do things like introduce family planning, introduce schooling for girls, etc. So religion can be a major factor, but it's not always as simple. The classic dichotomy is that, Muslims like large families, Christians have fewer. It's a lot more complicated than that.
Okay. Is population considered to be high population considered to be a pride and opportunity for a country, or is it a social, political, and economic threat? What's the view generally?
Sorry, high growth population or size of population? Say it again.
Is a fast population growth
Yeah.
domestically considered to be a sense of pride and opportunity, or is it a social, political, and economic threat?
Right. That depends country by country in Africa. There are countries, there are presidents who repeatedly make pronatal pronouncements in public. Magufuli in Tanzania was one. There was a famous speech a couple of years before he died saying that women should set free their ovaries. So there are a number of countries where presidents are still overtly pronatal, and one doesn't know the extent to which this is playing to the male section of the electorate that is equally pronatal or not. It's probably 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. So there are still a lot of presidents on the domestic campaign trail will still be pronatal, and they will portray their youthful, fast-growing populations as being a boon. But in private, there are an increasing number of presidents and governments and planning departments who are more measured about these things.
Okay. Do you have any final comments, or do you want to wrap up? Is there anything specific you think you'd like to add?
No, I just thank you for the questions. And if anyone does want to email me for further details, but without wishing to shamelessly flog the book, it does go into, it's now out in paperback this month, and all those questions have quite complicated answers that are all dealt with in the book. So that's why I think why they're good questions, because they're ones that frequently come up. This issue of pronatalism, for example, and the extent to which economic development is hampered potentially by the large percentage of the population that is dependent, yet the very young, for example. So if you are interested in any of the things that have come up before. Equally, the governments that are, mean business about this and think their population growth is too high for the moment, that is also a subject dealt with. So more to read there, or come back to me with questions.
Okay, one final, very, very quick question. Can you just comment on the brain drain from Africa to the West and elsewhere?
Well, I can. Yeah, I can. I will, rather. I think it has to be watched very carefully. And this is in a personal capacity. It's not something I remark on with a sort of demography hat on. I think recruiting 20,000 Kenyan nurses for the UK at a time when vast areas are underserved in Kenya, and where it's almost a kind of, well, it is a deal between governments, this. I personally feel pretty uneasy about this. And certainly anyone practicing in the Nigerian health sector be seriously alarmed, or is seriously alarmed, about the phenomenal number of trained medics from Nigeria who are now, and have for many decades, chosen to go and practice abroad. And I think that solutions can be found to this, and a better balance achieved. And I think it is. I think that in most cases at the moment, the African countries actually get no matter what remittances are going home and all the positives. I know there are two sides to the argument, balanced argument, but I still personally feel that in general, the African country, the host country, as it were, or the country of origin of the worker, gets a rawer deal.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.